Have you ever found yourself walking along and then all of a sudden stopped in your own tracks asking yourself what the right thing to do is? If that instance occurred, would you know what the answer is? Tonight, being an explorer of truth and virtue, I'm going to show you three approaches to ethics: teleological, deontological, and relations. I begin with teleological, which in Greek, teleo, means the final cause. That means the final cause can be found in nature. Now, Aristotle is one of the main proponents of teleological ethics, and he believed in experiencing human experiences rather than ideas. And I brought together this little PowerPoint by Les Miller that was designed in 2003 to give you some approaches to that. And I want to start by just basically going over the teleological approaches to ethics, which are this. Teleological has to do with the design or the purpose of something. Every art, every scientific inquiry, and every singular action and purpose aimed at some higher good. The leading proponent of this was Aristotle, and it was interpreted by St. Thomas Aquinas. Aristotle was born in 384 to 322 BC, and he was educated in Plato's academy. And as Aristotle said, as there are various actions, arts, and sciences, it also follows that the ends will also be various. Thus, health is the end of medicine. A vessel is the purpose of shipbuilding. Victory is the goal of strategy. And wealth is the aim of domestic economy. Now, when we take a look at this, he believes in using a path of reasoning, logic, as they say, because Aristotle was one of the founders of logic. With a path of reasoning, it says that if it's true that in the sphere of action there is an end which we wish for its own sake, and for the sake which we wish everything else, it is clear that this will be the supreme good. So what he's basically saying is he's saying that the supreme good is not only found in our actions as far as what we should do and ought to do, but inevitably it's also going to lead us to what we want to do, and the two will complement one another. So with that, going into it, and again it goes back to saying that we need to follow a path of rational thinking, which falls into logic. To act ethically, therefore, we have to engage our capacity to reason as we develop good character. This, in Aristotle's mind, was the highest form of happiness. In order to become happy, we develop habits that represent the best of what it means to be human. He calls these virtues. And last but not least, touching on Aristotle, I do want to talk about his doctrine of the means. The doctrine of the means with Aristotle means that moderation is good with everything. The doctrine of the means is finding an individual's happy medium between two extremes. For example, in virtue, we don't want to be too haphazard. We don't want to be so disconcerted that we don't think enough. The opposite of that would be overdoing things to satisfy our own needs. And he's saying find that happy medium, and he's also saying that that's relative to the individual, that there's no exact ideal form to that. Which leads me into deontological approach to ethics, which the main component was Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant said that the search for good is the search for God. Right, well, he said in more lines than not, it's judging the morality of an action based upon the action's adherence to a rules or set of rules that was set down and ordained by God. He believes that there's no individual path that we need to follow, that there's only one divine path that we need to follow, and ultimately happiness will be found in doing things just because it's the right thing to do, not because it's something we want to do. And this goes from deontology, goes from the study of duty, and that's where he's talking about duty. There's two types of reasoning which he uses: theoretical and practical reasoning, and how we come to know the laws that nature govern human behavior. Freedom of choice is not an issue, and what he means by that, when he says freedom of choice is not an issue, that we cannot be guided by our desires and our wants, as opposed to Aristotle, who says that also coincides with the ultimate true form of happiness. With Immanuel Kant, his true form of happiness is doing things just because it's the right thing to do, not because it's what we want to do. One of the problems with Immanuel Kant, and he has a famous theory called the axe murderer theory, and it says that if somebody who's coming running from an axe murderer runs into your house seeking shelter, hiding from the axe murderer, if the axe murderer knocks on your door and asks you where that girl is hiding and you know the answer, according to Immanuel Kant, the right thing to do is tell the truth. and which is kind of an interesting thing, because even though the ultimate good is to do things out of duty, ultimately doing the ultimate thing out of duty could lead to a negative consequence of someone else, which he has a tendency not to touch in too much. So he kind of creates kind of a stalemate when it comes to that. However, Immanuel Kant is definitely a good guideline and a good place to start when searching for the truth, because at least he has high expectations on our capabilities as human beings. It talks about the good is the aim of moral life, concerned with moving towards practical certainty in ethics. There's 3 areas of interest which we need to base the search for our supreme good, which is God, freedom, and immortality. Because humans cannot achieve supreme good out of their own power. We need God. You see, right there should give you a distinction between teleological ethics and deontological ethics. Theological ethics says that everything can be found within nature. The final cause can be found in nature. Immanuel Kant is saying that the final cause just begins with nature, and that'll set the guidelines to find a higher cause, which is the truest form of good. I do want to recite something from Plato, even though he's not part of this presentation, because Plato came, and I have it in Clark and Ortega, Ethics, the book of Ethics, the search for human fulfillment. Plato's allegory of the cave says that we are in a cave looking a shadow of what the true reality is, never understanding what that true reality is until we make that ascension out of the cave. Because all our lives, we were only told that the reality is the reflection coming from what's going on behind us, which we never had that opportunity to even turn around and look. So Plato talks about the ascension of the cave into enlightenment is the highest form of reality, the truest form of good, the truest form of virtue, the truest form of doing the right thing. It is an intangible. It's something that we'll never be able to clasp onto and touch, but it's an aim of a higher goal. And he also gives us responsibility once we know that. If we are to achieve the supreme good, then they must be able to choose it. So see, doing good to Immanuel Kant is not just because a person does good. He's got to want to do good. And achieving the supreme good is an immense task, impossible to achieve in this life, according to what he said. And the goodwill, which he talks about, it is impossible to conceive anything at all in the world which can be taken as good without qualification except a good will. For example, it is the will to do our duty for no other reason than it is our duty. Impulses and desires draw us away from our duty. Human action is morally good when it is done for the sake of duty. And he says, human action is morally good if it's done for the sake of duty. And his example here is, you may not want to go to your great aunt's funeral, but it is your duty to choose to go to honor your family. Human action is morally good when it's done for the sake of duty. Therefore, moral worth is not measured by our inclinations, but by the motive behind them. And he talks about maxims, and his most famous maxim is, I should act in a way that I would want everyone else in the world to act. And that is giving great responsibility and great judgment upon the individual who understands and who becomes enlightened by that greater sense of duty. And that's assuming that each and every one of us on this planet is going to be able to do the same thing. And if that's not great expectations, I don't know what is. Finally, we talk about another philosopher who kind of steps out of the circle of going back and forth on this, is by a gentleman by the name of Emmanuel Levinas. And Emmanuel Levinas had an approach to ethics called relational. He lost a great deal of his family into the Holocaust. He was highly renowned by the Pope. And his philosophy is definitely separate from Western philosophy. His belief is that everything is relational. The search for good is the central question of him. He says this is the search for God. Now, here's the catch. With him, he says individuals are unique, and this uniqueness is the interest of the good. So these things that we're looking for, and he says, can be found amongst each other, that within you, within me, within all of us, each one of us has a unique character which represents a trace of God. Just as when we look into the sunset, we never actually see the sun, but we see the inference of the sun setting, and that is a trace of God, but we never actually see the true face of God. That he's always one step ahead of us. And this talks about right here with my PowerPoint that the human face reveals the encounter with the human face, particularly with the eyes. A deep encounter with another person reveals this trace of God, as I was saying. Now, one thing I want to say here too is that with that, the face makes us responsible. The search for the good leads to our neighbor. God touches us through the faces of others. So in essence, this is a man with great high hopes that by team efforts and group dynamic, we will once and inevitably create a universal consciousness and an understanding of what is right for one another. If you notice, even with teleological or deontological, both approaches of ethics concern the individual first. He starts with group dynamic. One thing I also want to say too, when you're juggling your ideas and your ideologies and your schools of thought between the first two, teleological and deontological, I do want to give you a quote from Thomas White from Business Ethics. It's called The Philosophical Reader. In the pragmatic challenge of identifying and resolving ethical issues, neither approach should be ignored. And this is the best part of what he says. Because each acts as a check on the limitations of others. You know, when you look at ethics as a whole, it explores the nature of moral virtue and evaluates human actions. And I believe when you look at these three approaches, there's a piece of each and every one that can be used eclectically across the board to come up with your own assumption. You know, I just want to close here too with two final notes that talk about the similarities between the two. The similarities are people are fundamentally ethical. All three ethical stances search for the good. All three approaches touch an aspect of Christian ethics. Some of the differences: teleological is purpose-driven, deontological is duty-driven, and relational is relationship-driven. You know, and I hope tonight that I was able to shed some light on the three approaches of ethics: teleological, deontological, and relations. But more importantly, I hope that when you carry something away from tonight, that I want you to look at this as kind of like the fork in the road. If you really use these three approaches to ethics as your fork in the road, inevitably, no matter which of those three choices you make is going to be the search for good. So alas, I can conclude this by saying my three most favorite words: it's all good.